Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Canadian Shield, your trusted news source. My name is Sterling. I'm your host. The Bank of Canada announced another cut in their prime interest rate, 25 basis points, for what must be the third time in under 90 days. Now, the Liberals will try to convince you that this is a strong indication that their economic policies are working. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a strong indicator that the economy is, as I've told you, shrinking to the point of not working, shrinking to the point where the only people that will be doing any good, like making any money, will be the people in the middle. The upper echelons, the higher ups, will lose money like crazy. And they're aware of it. That's why they're trying to cut the prime rate so that you'll spend again. Now, before I get into it, I would encourage you to like this channel, subscribe to this channel, share this video. I am up against a lot of censorship. I am wholeheartedly being turned down in the algorithm. So by liking the video and by commenting on the video and by sharing this video with your friends or your networks, it shows the algorithm that people are in fact interested in me, and perhaps I can extend my reach. I want you to pay attention to some of the words that are coming out of the governor's mouth, the governor of the bank's mouth, and how they are words that have already been spoken in other politicians. And the reason I want you to pay attention to that is because what seems to have happened is that the governor has become a political player. Instead of just being the accountant and the economist that he trained to be, he's trying to sway and influence the population. I'll get into that in a minute, but let's have a listen to some of what he has to say.
Today, we lowered our policy interest rate by 25 basis points to 4.25%. This is the third consecutive decrease since June. Our decision reflects two main considerations. First, headline and core inflation have continued to ease as expected. And second, as inflation gets closer to the target, we want to see economic growth pick up to absorb the slack in the economy so inflation returns sustainably to the 2% target. Inflation continues to reflect the push and pull of opposing forces. Overall weakness in the economy continues to pull inflation down. But price pressures in shelter and some other services are holding inflation up. Since the July NPR, the upward forces coming from prices for shelter and some other services have eased slightly. At the same time, the downward pressure coming from excess supply in the economy remains. If inflation continues to ease broadly in line with our July forecast, it is reasonable to expect further cuts in our policy interest rate. Recent indicators suggest there is some downside risk to this pickup. In particular, preliminary indicators suggest that economic activity was soft through June and July, and employment growth has stalled in recent months. The unemployment rate has risen over the last year to 6.4% in June and July. The rise is concentrated in youth and newcomers to Canada who are finding it more difficult to get a job. Business layoffs remain moderate, but hiring has been weak. The slack in the labor market is expected to slow wage growth, which remains elevated relative to productivity.
Okay, so he said a lot of things right there. First of all, he wanted to stress how it was the third time in a row. That's not something that an economist would care to mention. He's not going to worry about that kind of track record. That's put there because he's trying to... What he wants people to do is to get consumer confidence again. And I've told you this. This announcement, this move is desperation. Well, the beginning of desperation. You heard him say that housing was getting cheaper, and I don't necessarily concur with that, but I would believe it that prices are coming down on purchases slightly in an effort to get consumers to buy. And then you heard him say that June and July are forecast to be quite slow, which is to say the initial numbers that are coming in indicate that nobody's working. Further, you heard him say that the country reached 6.4% in unemployment in youth and newcomers. So all of the jobs that are really not the high paying, or the teenagers' jobs that they get, or the newcomer who will do whatever job he has to survive in a brand new country, those jobs are not hiring people. And what companies are not laying off is one of the problems that they have is that what they're paying people is too much. They're overinflated. So all of these are horrible indicators for the economy. The young people are not working the menial jobs, meaning that people are not shopping in restaurants, people are not buying coffee, there's a lot of ripples there. And he said, well, housing and other price pressures are still, they have come down a little bit, but they're still putting increases on the upward pressure, is how he puts it. So the other services are going to be the carbon tax. That's why he didn't want to list it. It's going to be how that's impacting grocery prices. So food and housing and food is still through the roof, and people are not going to restaurants. That's what you should take away from what he just said there. And by the look of it, the summer numbers are going to be bad in what is traditionally in Canada the greatest time for earning, when everybody's cutting grasses and everybody's out and about and nobody's in school, so people are spending money. People are getting summer jobs. The economy, the GDP should be larger, should be booming. People are saving up all summer to buy a car for the fall. None of that is happening. Okay, all that preamble was just to soften the blow. That was to give you an idea that don't worry about it, we got it all under control. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of how the reality, the truth of it, the matter of what I've been telling you for a couple of months is now going to come out of his mouth.
Turning to price pressures, CPI inflation eased further to 2.5% in July, and our preferred measures of core inflation also moved lower. With the share of CPI components growing above 3% now around its historical norm, there is little evidence of broad-based price pressures. But shelter price inflation is still too high. It remains the biggest contributor to overall inflation, despite some early signs of easing. Inflation also remains elevated in some other services. At the same time, with inflation getting closer to the target, we need to increasingly guard against the risk that the economy is too weak and inflation falls too much.
Now, I want you to think back to when he said that there was a large supply, right? Because what's happening is people are not spending their money. What he just said there is that we need to make sure that we don't all stop spending and just keep our money in the bank. And then the individual who's trying to sell the product will sell it to you at a discount and a discount and a discount. Just like when there was all kinds of money, the government was printing and throwing it around, they kept charging you more and more and more and more and more. Now the reverse is happening because you're not spending your money, because rent is too high, because gas prices are too high, because food prices are too high. Because they are too high, you've started to go into hold your money, which I told you in a couple of videos ago that savings have increased. They don't like that, right? They want you putting it in RSPs and all that kind of stuff, sure, but not just straight up, let me put it in the savings account where you can just keep your hands on it, keep your eye on it. I know what you mean. Don't worry, I get it. But even though they are aware of it, they're desperate to make you not do that. And that's what this statement said, right? We have to be aware that we don't let the inflation fall below 2%. Why? What do you and I care if the price of a house today is the same as the price of a house 20 years from now? That would mean wages are the same. That would mean everything would be the same. What does it matter to you and I? Where's that 2% go? That's what you got to ask yourself. Who's pulling that inflationary rate out and putting it in their pocket? So now they're worried that you'll stop spending, and that will mean that people will have to begin layoffs. And I'm going to let you let them finish, then I'll explain to you.
Excess supply in the economy continues to put downward pressure on inflation, while price increases in shelter and some other services are holding inflation up. We did discuss, looking forward, we did discuss some different scenarios where it might be appropriate to slow the pace of declines in interest rates. We also discussed scenarios where it could be appropriate to cut by 50 basis points. So you're going to get the summary of deliberations in a couple of weeks, but to give you a couple of examples, if those upward forces in inflation prove to be stronger than we expected, if there's significantly less slack in the economy than we assess, yes, it might be appropriate to slow the pace of declines. On the other hand, if the economy was significantly weaker, if inflationary pressures, if the downward pressure on inflation was, if inflation was significantly weaker than we expected, yes, it could be appropriate to take a bigger step, something bigger than 25 basis points.
So you heard him. If inflation starts to come down, then we will begin to cut our rate because we need people to spend money. And the number one thing that he keeps mentioning is housing. So he said, what he said there was this. He said, if people start to buy houses, then we probably won't make any more interest cuts. If people stop spending money and inflation starts to drop below 2% as manufacturers and people start to sell it, like as quickly as they can so they're not sitting on all that stock, well, then we're going to have to lower their rates even more so that we don't feel it in our bank accounts. And that's what you need to take away from this, right? Is that by keeping your money in your pocket, you're actually empowering yourself. You are actually getting them to realize that you are the one that keeps them going. And now they will begin to go out of their way to give you the bargains and the deals and settle for a couple of $100 million less so that they don't go flat out, so we don't go into a full-blown recession, which is a word that they don't even like people to say. This is because your purchasing power has been taken from them and given back to you by just simply holding on to your money, by not buying the overpriced condominium, by not saying to yourself that I will be happy by owning nothing. Now the money is not showing up on their end, and they're like, wait a second, this is a problem on our end. If we don't have this, and this, basic economics tells us that this, and this will happen. I mean, by basic economics, I mean, they've known this since like the Greeks were in charge of the planet, right? Thousands of years. This isn't something this is the way math works. And he just said, because the question was, well, why didn't you drop it 50 basis points? And he goes, well, you heard what he said. If we find that the upward pressures are starting to ease, meaning that if people start to buy houses, then we probably might see a decline, which is to say that we're probably going to stop lowering the interest rate for a little while. If, however, people don't spend any money, if the inflation starts to go lower and lower because people are only marking up 1% instead of 2%, then we will lower our points even more again, so that you can start to do the thing that they want you to do the most, right? Which is this gigantic credit swap. Where I don't have any sympathy for them. They should have got it in front of it. They should have kept the government under control. And if you and I get cheaper food, because that's the one thing that bothers me the most, right? Like he says, housing and other factors, but they are all essentials. It's housing, it's food. He's talking about 2% or going below 2% on what you might spend on blue jeans or something to that effect. I think that we need to have housing and food as inexpensive as it can be. I don't believe that we should be paying through the nose for a one-bedroom condominium that's really not even a good place to raise a child, because she doesn't have the exercise. They don't have the fun areas that backyards bring. Anyway, I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you next time.